Okay, and good morning again from Hempsel's. My name is James Hempsel and I'm the chair of today's national webinar to raise awareness and motivate families to use their 2-year-old entitlements. Welcome to so many of you today, health visitors, colleagues from Job Centre Plus, from housing, from employment support projects, community organisations, parents, grandparents, early years workers, family support workers, local authority staff, and everyone else. Apologies if I've missed you out on that very long list. Today, we have a wonderful opportunity to spend time and to consider what small, medium, and large size things we can all do in our day-to-day roles and contact with families to help disadvantaged families take up the preschool entitlements that are funded for them. This webinar has been funded by the Department for Education, and we've had wonderful support from the Department of Work and Pensions and the Institute of Health Visitors. To help you find out about today's webinar and get you here today. This is a recorded session, so if you are unable to join us for the whole session, or you would like to share this webinar with colleagues who weren't able to be here today, you will find out where the recording of this webinar is held in due course. We will be sharing the slides with you, and those will be available to you at the end of today's session after you've completed a short online evaluation. You are all on mute, apart from our panelists, so if you do want to make a comment or make a question on this Zoom webinar, then use the chat function. I think some of you might have even found the Q&A, but chat or Q&A if you can, and we will keep a good observation around what's happening on that on those functions. If you're not able to use either of those, then you're more than welcome to email us at info@hempsels.com. So that's info@hempsels.com, and we will again appraise your comments and questions if you have them. There are 1 or 2 Q&A sessions throughout the morning. So what will we share and cover? Next slide. Well, today we're going to be looking at the benefits of childcare and early learning for children and families. We're going to provide and share clear and up-to-date information about the 2-year-old entitlement and, of course, other forms of childcare support for families. And to consider how we can all use messaging that shares that information and knowledge about the entitlements with eligible families and disadvantaged families in particular, in ways that help them understand it, consider how it will benefit them as a family and their children, and importantly, motivate them to take it up. That's why we're here. So we will hear from the Institute of Health Visiting, we will hear from Department for Work and Pensions, Job Centre Plus, and we'll hear from Coram Family and Childcare about how they all believe we can build in realistic actions into our day-to-day roles. And to help you do that after, as I've said, we'll share the slides with you, which are full of links and ways in which you can find out more. So let's have a look at the agenda. 9:30 prompt start. We will start thinking about the context and the background to the 2-year-old entitlement. We'll think about the eligibility and the processes for that, and the principles and early thoughts about how we engage families in their early years and childcare entitlements. We know it's a long session, 3 hours, and we know everybody's busy, but we will have a break at about 11:15 for 10 minutes. And then in the second half, we'll explore the parent journey from finding out about their entitlements all the way through to using them. We'll consider SEND, special educational needs and disability considerations, and put some more detail on how we get the message across to eligible families. As I said, there's some opportunities for Q&A, And then we'll finish before or for 12:30 with a short evaluation. There's just 2 or 3 online questions, and then you get the link to be able to download today's slides. So why are we having today's session? Well, childcare changes lives. It supports children to grow, to develop and to learn whilst they are preparing to go to school when they're older. It helps us reach children earlier. It gives us a dialogue and a relationship with the families that they belong to. And it gives us a rare and valuable and timely opportunity for us to identify if there's something else that that child needs. Have they got any unmet needs that we need to recognise and support so that they don't fall further behind by the time they are of school age? It enables parents to make choices in economic, employment and training too. We want today to increase your confidence, to raise awareness and motivate least advantaged families to take up, especially their 2-year-old, 15 hours early learning entitlement, because it's such an amazing change your life offer for families. And we'll say more about that later. Indeed, our measure today is that we do grow your confidence in being able to get that message across. So we will be asking you in that survey at the end, to what extent have we succeeded to grow your confidence just a little? But before we start, let's think about your confidence now. If you were to rate yourself out of a score of 10 for your confidence in supporting families with the 2-year-old entitlement, with 1 not being very confident at all and 10 being supremely confident, very confident, what sort of score would you give yourself this morning? Make a note. Just take a moment to think of a number. To what extent would you score yourself in confidence on your ability to support families with the 2-year-old entitlement? You don't have to share the score. It might be quite nice to see some of them on the chat function. But I just want you to take that moment to reflect and to think and to give yourself a score and make a note of it, because we will return to that question in the survey at the end. So it'll be interesting to see how we can track and make a difference to that confidence level. So once you've made that note, let's think about some true or false questions to get our brains working as well. There's 6 questions there, and I'd like you to have a look at those and to think if you think any of these are true or if they are false. We're asking if all 2-year-olds get 15 hours funded preschool learning each week. We're asking that if the 2-year-old entitlement is new. We're asking take-up is high. If take-up is high, and is it outstripping supply of places? We're asking, is it only available in nurseries? Does it affect family benefits? And are 2-year-olds too young to be in provision? So you may have a mixture of true and false answers there. My answers, I believe all of those statements to be false. And those are some of the things that we want to be visiting throughout today's session. Not all 2-year-olds get 15 hours funded preschool learning each week. This is a targeted initiative for the most disadvantaged families. It used to be about 40%, the 40% least advantaged families. The percentage is slightly different these days, but essentially it's families that meet the criteria of receiving various benefits and perhaps are in low income working families. And that's often a myth. People forget that this entitlement is open to families that are working, but they have low incomes. We'll tell you more about the criteria later. It isn't new either. 2-year-old funded entitlements have been around as early as 2006 as small pilots and tests, but the full national rollout started in 2013, some 8 years ago. So it's become quite an embedded part of the early years world. Take up is reasonably high, but it's not outstripping supply of places. I'll talk later about the dynamics of 2020 and a COVID-19 and a pandemic year on take-up, but take-up could be higher, and there's certainly a supply of places out there in provision wanting to welcome more 2-year-olds into their places. And when it comes to places, it's not just in nurseries. Children can take up their place in school nurseries, preschool groups, children's centres, childminders, all sorts of different provision. And no, it doesn't affect a family's benefit payments. That's often a myth that we hear. There's no monetary value attached to the entitlement in terms of income into a family. So it doesn't affect benefits. Just think of it as if it's like school. You know, a child's school place doesn't affect their benefits, and it's funded in a similar, not the same, but in a similar way. And 2-year-olds aren't too young to be in provision. There's amazing good quality provision out there, and they all work hard to meet the needs of all 2-year-olds. And it adds value to that 15 hours each week adds value to their learning that they have at home. So they're not too young, and I'll say a little bit more about that later as well. But don't just take my word for it. Look at these quotes. Why do we have the entitlements, and what difference do they make? Well, this one's a learning focused, an education focused outcome. It's, you know, it's such a key developmental phase before 2 and at 2. And if you want to find out more about the importance of early years and how it affects children, look at the Duchess of Cambridge's, the Royal Foundation's website and the films that they're starting to develop to promote the importance of learning in the early years. This is when children's brains are developing and their sense of being and self is developing. It's a vitally important time. And if we miss this, and if children run the risk of falling behind, and by the time they are 3 and 4 and are starting school, then it can be very difficult for them to catch up. So hours spent in formal and informal early childhood education and childcare has benefits for their cognitive and social emotional development. The next piece of research on the next slide is more health focused. The foundations for virtually every aspect of human development are laid in that early childhood period. So a good quote there from the Marmot Review in 2010. Look at the next slide. The message here is that all different types of early years and childcare are equally important. Can we have the nutshells? That's it. So they're equally important. We place equal value in children accessing their entitlements, be it in a home-based setting delivered by a childminder, or in a preschool group or a day nursery. It could be a nursery class in school or a reception unit in school. And out-of-school childcare for those older children is another important aspect of provision. All equally important, all delivering Ofsted registered and inspected provision, all following the same guidance, and if they're funded, following the same funding regime as set down by their funding local authority. So a tremendous amount of importance played when we're talking to parents is about their individual choice for the type of provision that they want to use. Sometimes they may hear that their funded place is available in a nursery, but actually for that family, it may be much better and much more appropriate for a smaller home-based setting for their child. It's important that we mix and match the provision to the needs of families. Okay, there's your context and background. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Joe Pringle, who's going to describe how the entitlement fits with everything else and how we can support children and families.
Morning, and thanks, James. So let's think a little bit about what the 2-year-old entitlement is. As James has already mentioned, it's for our least advantaged children, and in families receiving non-work related benefits and low-income employment. It's about the making sure that the cohort of children who are the greatest risk of falling behind their peers before they start school don't. The 2-year-old entitlement is about getting children into 2-year-old places if they're eligible, to mitigate that risk, so to ensure that children don't fall behind, and to support the wider outcomes of those children and the families within which they live. So let's think a little bit about what actually is it. Can I have the next slide, please? So it is up to, James mentioned 15 hours a week, and I think the important thing to think about there is that it's up to 15 hours a week, that families don't have to take up all the entitlement when their child becomes eligible. And actually, for some families, it might not look like 15 hours a week. We talk about 15 hours a week for 38 weeks of the year. But in essence, the entitlement is actually 570 hours. And for some families, whether they be working, whether they be studying, whether they want provision all year round, what that looks like in a week might also be very different. So they haven't got to have it all. It might look very different. It's not just for 38 weeks. Some providers will actually allow families to stretch it across the year for longer. And that comes with a number of other benefits for families, especially for those who are working, who would like to reduce their childcare bill for a longer and not incur large holiday bills. So the first criteria is around economic criteria. There are lots of there's a set of benefits that families need to meet under this eligibility bit, which is around non-work and work. There's lots of small print here, and detailed information is available through the Childcare Choices website. But in essence, we are looking at the non-work and low income working benefits. As well as the economic criteria, there are another cohort of children that are eligible. Can I have the next slide, please? So families who are also eligible are families who have children who are looked after by the council. They have a current statement of special educational needs, or they have a health, education, health and care plan, that the child themselves receives disability living allowance, or they've left care under special guardianship order, childcare arrangements order, or adoption order. There's another small cohort of families that were brought into eligibility as of August 2019. And these are Zombrano carers, some families with recourse, with no recourse to public funds, and children of a subset of failed asylum seekers. All that detail will be held on your local authority website through the application process, or you can find out more by using the link at the bottom of the page, which takes you to Childcare Choices. But your local authority family information service and application process will have all the information and enable you to find out a bit more. So let's think a little bit about the 2-year-old entitlement and how it fits with the other entitlements. Once in a place, a child or a family doesn't lose their entitlement. So they keep those 15 hours, those 570 hours, right up until they reach the eligibility criteria of the universal entitlement, which is for all children. So whilst some 2-year-olds will be able to access funded place if they meet the criteria, all 3 and 4-year-olds are eligible for a place if they are not eligible for a place. Apologies for that, my mind's strayed. Now, so we go from some 2-year-olds to all 3 and 4-year-olds the term after their 3rd birthday, to having some 3 and 4-year-olds being able to access more. So some families who meet the extended entitlement and the work-related criteria can benefit from an additional 570 hours. And again, it's up to. So it might be 15 hours over 38 weeks. For some families, it might look very different. And this is when we refer to 30 hours childcare. As many 2-year-olds transition into 30 hours because their families are working families, families will benefit from not just the additional childcare, but actually the additional income that they're able to achieve when they're working. This route map provides an opportunity for families and for family members to think about returning to work, preparing for work, thinking about what they might want to do when their children are 2. Next slide, please. So thinking about how it all fits together again. So families transition from 2-year-olds to the universal and potentially to 30 hours. The hours, as I've said, can be spread across the year. So 570 per annum. Families might want to take fewer each week. In addition, some families might want more. And families can buy more around their 2-year-old place, and they can buy more around the additional entitlements that they have. Early years services are paid for in 3 different ways. The first is through government early years and childcare funding, which is passported to local authorities through to their contracted early years and childcare providers. You will usually call this, and I've referred to it throughout, as early years funding. The second is where parents pay directly outside of their funded provision because they need more. They might choose to buy additional hours they require outside of the funded hours, and they might want to purchase the additional services covered or not covered by the funding, which according to guidance is trips, food, services, etc. The third part of the jigsaw is where parents receive financial help towards the costs through a wide variety of different sources, such as childcare vouchers, employer voucher scheme, workplace childcare offers, tax-free childcare, universal credit, or the childcare element of work and tax credit, and a number of other things to support learning, such as Care to Learn, or additional support for higher education. There's an awful lot of things to understand here. I'm going to go through them, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, as when we get to the end, I will tell you a bit about a calculator that families can use, or you can use with families to help them understand what they might be entitled to, what they might be able to save, and what they might be able to get on top of their funded hours. Bear in mind that all these things that I'm going to talk about are not just relevant to a funded place. They're relevant for childcare of all ages, and in the majority up to age 16. So let's first of all think about tax-free childcare. Tax-free childcare really isn't much to do with tax. It's a savings scheme in which families pay into their tax-free childcare account, and tax-free childcare account then pays the childcare provider. Tax-free childcare is for working parents and for self-employed parents. There is an earning threshold of up to 100,000 for one individual within the family, and a minimum threshold of £139 per week at the moment, but that is the minimum threshold based on an income equal to 16 hours at national minimum wage or living wage. So that does shift from year to year. Families accessing tax-free childcare can't receive tax credits, universal credits, or childcare vouchers. Tax-free childcare has taken over from childcare vouchers, but some families may still be in receipt and may be using childcare vouchers still. Tax-free childcare, as I mentioned earlier, is for all children age 0 to 11 or up to 16 or 17 if the child is disabled. For every £8 that a family for any paid for childcare up and above their funded entitlements pay into their online tax-free childcare account, the government adds an extra £2, up to £2,000 within the year. So if we looked at a childcare bill of around £830, the parent would pay into their tax-free childcare account £664, and the government would pay in 166, and the childcare provider would get the 830. So a saving and a help for families, especially at the moment. And that, again, as I mentioned earlier, is not just for families within the funded entitlements as we're talking. So let's think about tax credits for childcare. Again, for working families within the UK with children under 16 or 17 if disabled. There's a cap of within the funding, and it's up to 70% of childcare costs. Now it will be a sliding scale. It's based on economic position, so it will mean that the greater amount will be paid out to families that need it, and that will get smaller dependent on individual family circumstances. So for families who have transitioned and have moved over onto universal credit, it's again similar. Families must be working or due to start work and claiming universal credit. Within universal credit, families can claim up to 85% of their childcare, up to a cap as well of around £646 for one child, or just over £1,100 for more than 2 children. It can't be used with tax credits or tax-free childcare. So it's a standalone to either of those. Universal credit being on universal credit shouldn't be a barrier to families using childcare. There are 2 options for families. They can potentially access, pending individual circumstances, a budgeting loan to pay for maybe the deposit for childcare or the advance for any childcare. It can be applied for by a parent to obtain or retain childcare, in particular for those upfront costs that might be a barrier for some families. It can be applied for any time during a universal credit claim. The 6-month rule of being in receipt of eligible benefit can be waived for childcare costs, and it can be applied for in addition to the Flexible Support Fund. And the Flexible Support Fund is another opportunity for families to access funding by talking to the person dealing with their universal credit process to pay for those upfront costs. The budgeting loan does have to be paid back, but the Flexible Support Fund doesn't. As well as the universal credit, tax-free childcare, and the other benefit side of things, for families who are studying, there are a number of different options. For our younger families, then there is Care to Learn, which is for families who are studying in school or sixth form college. There's also help from many colleges through families who are in further education. And then there are grants and student loan for families who are in higher education. So a variety of different things that families can use to support them to pay for additional childcare and the additional services outside of the funded hours that we talked about earlier. And they all slot together to enable families to manage, to reduce their childcare bill, to enable them to return to work, to prepare for work. As well as those other bits. Now, one of the things I just want to mention is that we have talked throughout that some of these things don't work together, and families can't have everything. So for a family who is accessing universal credit, they would not be able to access the tax-free childcare part. So families do need to use the calculator to work out which are the things that are better for them. As well as the funding options and the government grants and the variety of things that can help, there is additional funding to support families with children with special educational needs and disabilities. As I referred to earlier, tax-free childcare is available for working families, for families with a child with a disability aged 0 to 16. And the amount that they can access through the tax-free childcare scheme is higher. In addition, families of parents of 3 and 4-year-olds of a child who receives disability living allowance, the earlier setting is able to receive a Disability Access Fund. Disability Access Fund provides a small pot of money, £615 per child per year, to support the earlier setting, to meet the individual needs of the child and to make any reasonable adjustments that might need to be made. As well as that, all local authorities will have a SEN Inclusion Fund to support early years providers, again, to meet the individual needs of children. And each local authority will have information about what providers can access and what that looks like. Because local authorities will and do slightly different things. So, lots of information there. Remember, you don't need to know everything, and we don't need to be the guru of all things to support families to reduce the cost of childcare or early years entitlement funding. We just need to know where to go. So as I've referenced several times, the childcare calculator can help you and the families that you work with to check what they might get, to work out what they might be able to benefit from and what might look best for them. Also, a useful starting point is introduce families to childcare choices. All the slides that I've used throughout there are taken from childcare choices. Childcare choices gives more detail, and it helps to raise awareness of what help they might have. Many families don't think that they can access or don't realise that these things are available. Many families will say, I can't buy more, even though I need more, when maybe they could. So by signposting, by sharing this information, by directing families and talking a little bit about, you know, there is more, you could potentially have more, you could pay for those additional hours. That baby place is possible because the government tax-free childcare place will pay 20% of it. So use these slides and use the links to find out a bit more yourself, but also to support families to find out more. I'll hand back to James.
Thank you, Joe. And I've been keeping a keen eye on the chat, and I don't blame anybody for feeling overwhelmed with the level of detail and the different opportunities that there are to access early years and childcare, and all of those that extensive range of different funding pots and help to pay for childcare, depending on the objective of that fund, whether it to be to support parents studying or at work or children's early learning. It's a very complicated picture. If it was simple, we wouldn't need a webinar like today. So we are hoping to do as much as we can to summarise and to provide a clear route map through what's available for families and how we can support families with it. Some of you latecomers might have missed, and I can certainly see on the chat that you're asking if the slides are going to be shared, and I'll repeat that yes, they are. There's an evaluation at the end of today's session, and you get a click through to be able to download those slides. There's also the sessions being recorded for those of you not able to stay for the whole session or want to share it with colleagues or to revisit those bits that at first may seem very complicated. There's been some questions around what you've just been saying, Joe, so I might pose some of those to you. There's some that I'll be able to answer myself. There was certainly the comment that how many 2-year-olds realistically will have gone through all of the hurdles and the process of achieving an education, care and health plan. Well, this has always been a common observation about the eligibility, is that to get an education, care and health plan, it's a long, complicated process, and very few 2-year-olds at the beginning of their entitlement actually have what's called an EHCP. But it would be a nonsense if we didn't have that in the criteria. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Joe.
No, just to reiterate that no, I haven't.
Okay, great. We also had a comment about, and I think you answered this actually, it's about what about families with no recourse to public funds? I think you covered that in your slide around the extended eligibility there.
Yeah, and also just to reiterate that all 3- and 4-year-olds are entitled to their universal place. And there are some additional criteria from 2019 which do cover under the families with no recourse under certain parts of legislation.
So, and as you said, the good news is that with all of this detail that you've shared, these 2 web links on this final slide from you are one of the easiest things to navigate, i.e. all of that is held on the Childcare Choices website, which is an HMRC site, and the Childcare Calculator does enable people to filter through what may be more applicable to them. I've got a question here about location. So can families choose, we've talked about that they can choose the type of childcare to meet their family's needs, but can they choose the location of it as well?
Absolutely. A family, ultimately families will choose their childcare and their early education provision that suits their needs. For some families that might be close to home and within walking distance. For other families it might actually be close to work. And work might actually be in Bradford, because I'm up north at the moment, rather than in Wakefield. And so yes, families can take up their entitlements to suit them. Local authorities pay funding on children within the place, not from where their home postcode is.
Yes, that's the clear message. They don't have to access it in the same local authority area where they live, because different local authorities have different arrangements in terms of cross-border funding.
Absolutely, and a family's priority might be that they may often be late, or getting out of work might not be easy, and having their early education or childcare close to where they work might be more of a priority than closer to home.
And not all providers offer the 2-year-old funded entitlement either. Why might that be?
Different business or local providers can choose what they offer, and depending on where they are in the country, depending on many things, depending on demographics, depending on their business model, and depending on funding rates, providers will make different decisions. In some areas, some childcare providers are predominantly funded places based on demographics, based on local families and demand. In other areas, a provider's business might be full day care, and actually, providing 2-year-old places might not fit into that model because they have little demand. Where we do need to be careful is, and to consider parental need and supply, is in areas where, more rural areas, and in areas where there might only be one provision. So it's a provider choice. It's very much led by demand. And, you know, parents, the beauty of the childcare market is its diversity. So families shopping around to find out what works for them in size, in shape. You mentioned earlier childminding. For some 2-year-olds, being with a childminder in that small home-based provision might actually be a better option than the larger full daycare nursery. So it's around the needs of the child, the family, and what providers are able to offer as well.
I mean, I would add to that. I think there's the supply and demand for 2-year-old, for the universal 3 and 4s, and for 30 hours is highly dynamic. It always has been, and a provider may not have previously offered 2-year-old funded places. But as their market changes and as demand shifts, then sometimes 2-year-old places are opened up in a setting. So even if you've been aware that a local setting has not offered 2-year-old places in the past, they may do now, or they may do in the future. And later on, I'm going to be sharing a slide that looks at the impact of COVID-19 on exactly that, on supply and demand, and how eligibility is going up and down. It's really, because actually, if we think about the economic impact of the year that we've had, we may see children falling in and out of eligibility for 2-year-old funding and for 30 hours childcare as well. So the good news is all children can access some sort of funded early years and childcare provision at some point before they start school. Some start at 2 because they meet that criteria. All can get 15 hours for 3 and 4-year-olds, and some can get an extra 15 if their family is working and they meet that criteria as well. So lots of criteria, lots of different funding streams, and thank you for referencing the additional considerations for children with SEND as well. And I know that's something that our next speaker is going to pick up on, as well as the parental response to this entitlement. And so the next session is around the perspective of eligible families. What do we know about that? What have we learned? And we're going to hear from Megan Jarvie from Coram Family and Childcare.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction, James. I am head of Coram Family and Childcare. We are a national charity that focus on childcare and the early years. And the reason that's our focus is that we can see the real difference that good quality childcare and early education policy make for families in the here and now, changing lives right now, but also in the longer term, the impact it can have on children's outcomes in the longer term. One of the things that we do is we run a national programme called Parent Champions, who are parent volunteers who give some time to go out and talk to other parents in their communities about childcare and other early years services. And they're really effective in passing on these key messages and reaching the families that might be less likely to engage with services. And what I want to talk about this morning is what we've learned from doing that about, as James said, what gets parents excited about childcare? Why is it that they take up this offer? Why some families have doubts about it? What are the barriers that they face to using childcare? And how a conversation with you could help to overcome some of those barriers, as conversations with parent champions so often help families to overcome those barriers. So if we go on to the next slide, I wanted to start with, why do parents love childcare? So a lot of this, we've already gone through some of the evidence about the benefits of childcare, but there's often a more sort of a softer side that makes parents really like it as well. So there's lots in it for parents. It gives them the most precious gift that parents always desperately want: time. So it's worth, there's no amount of money that some parents would pay for just a little bit more time in their week. And they can use this for more time with siblings or other family members. A lot of parents use the time when their children are in childcare to start looking at their own personal development, to start looking for work, going into training, getting qualifications, and use it as a real springboard to start thinking about where they want to be in themselves. We know that life for a lot of families is really busy, and so those childcare sessions can provide some much needed time to do the appointments, the chores, all the things that we need to keep keep our household going as parents. Or it can provide that much needed time to have an opportunity to have a bit of time to yourself as a parent, a bit of relaxation, which can be a rare opportunity. And as we often say as parents, you can't pour from an empty cup. Parents need to take care of themselves in order to be able to give themselves to their children as well. So to me, all these things seem pretty persuasive. Like, that gift of time is quite special, and these sometimes work in persuading parents about the benefits of childcare, but they are not nearly as powerful as the arguments around the benefits for their children. What we find is something switches in the brain, and actually parents become so much less concerned about their own well-being and much more concerned about their children's well-being. So on the next slide, we've gone through some of the benefits for children that parents can find really, really persuasive. There's a lot of academic evidence about the benefits of childcare. James went through some of that earlier on, and that is all absolutely true. It's really useful for you to know about it. It often doesn't change minds. We can look at all the evidence in the world for hundreds and hundreds of children and what's made a difference, and you kind of go, yeah, maybe. And then you hear a story about another child, or you see their development, you see how they've changed as a result of going to childcare. And that can be the penny drop moment for parents where they say, yeah, I get it now. I get what makes a difference. So those personal stories can be really important. And some of the soft sides that come from going to childcare, the opportunity for children to make friends with other children, to learn some of those really important life skills that can be harder to do at home, around taking turns, sharing, so that comes from being part of that environment with other children. You also get to do some of the activities that we know are really important to children's development, but can be hard to do at home. I've put messy play on there. We all know it's good for children. Nobody wants to spend all their afternoon cleaning up after a good messy play session. It can improve children's ability to communicate with others. Their speech and language can improve from going to childcare. We know that childcare workers are professionals. They can really help with children's development. They know how to support that development and those outcomes. And much further down the road, this often feels like a really long way away when you're talking to parents about the 2-year-old offer, but it does help children get ready for school. It makes that transition just that little bit easier if they've been to nursery as well. And so although that feels quite a long way away, it is quite a helpful thing to start thinking about early. So this feedback mainly has come from our parent champions. So I wanted to just give a little bit more information on the next slide about what our parent champions programme is. As I said, they are parent volunteers who give a couple of hours a week to talk to other parents about free early education entitlements and childcare and other services that are available to them. The very fact that this programme exists, I think, is very telling of the difference that the free childcare or free early education entitlement offer. I saw a question there about what's the difference. I use both terms, early education and childcare. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Both of them are covered by the free offer for the government funded offer for 2, 3 and 4-year-olds. But yes, so the difference that makes to families' lives is shown by the fact that they are willing to give up that precious time. As I keep saying, time is precious for parents, to go out and volunteer and talk to other parents in their communities. Childcare has made such a difference for their family that they are passionate enough to share that with their community. They're evangelical, they want other people to know about the difference it can make. And that's quite an amazing thing to see. It's real proof that this is a life-changing offer, and they want to go out and spread the word. Can we go on to the next slide as well? There we go. Because I want to talk a bit more about why this approach works. So that passion that parents feel, they pass it on to other parents. That's part of the reason why they are able to change minds and help parents to start seeing the childcare offer as something that could work for their family. We base this model on the fact that there's research that shows that parents are more likely to trust other parents when it comes to choosing childcare. And it's based on what we've seen keeps it going and really makes it work, is the ability to build up that rapport and share personal experiences. Now, obviously, this programme is based on parent volunteer and a parent-to-parent model, but I think it's something that's quite replicable for you as family-facing professionals, because it is about a personal relationship and personal experience and having time to have that conversation. It's giving parents the time and space to be honest about some of the doubts that they had. And I think that for many of you, the childcare is not the core part of your job. It's something that you do on top of other things. And so you can have quite a powerful role of, you're not there to sell it to them. You're talking to them about it because you genuinely believe it can make a difference. And that's much like parent champions. They're not seen as having that vested interest. And that allows parents to be a bit more honest, to open up. If one of the reasons that you might not have used childcare is because you think all the nurseries in your area are rubbish, you might not say that to a nursery manager or someone who has a role. They might say it to you or to someone else, and you'd have the opportunity then to explore that, to see what evidence they have for thinking that, and what their options are around childcare locally. It's also one of the other reasons it works is that it recognises that there are real barriers to using childcare. Although we're talking today a lot about the benefits and how good it can be for families, there are real genuine reasons why it's a difficult decision for families, and it gives them that opportunities to think about that, and that they're able to reach often families that are most likely to miss out. The next slide just gives some stats about the Parent Champions approach, and it basically what I want to take from this is 1 in 3 parents that Parent Champions talk to go on to use free early education. It's an approach that works. It's not one that you have to use. What I'm trying to do today is to say, this is what we've learned from that approach that might be useful for you and your job. And so now I'll go on to some of those things that we've learned that might be useful for you. And I'm going to talk a lot about the barriers that parents talk about. And hopefully I'm going to try my hardest not to get too negative and bogged down in what the difficulties are, but to talk about the barriers so that you know the different things that families face. You'll have seen a lot of these. A lot of them might not be new for you, but also some of the things that Parent Champions have used to help overcome these barriers and what can work in changing minds. So if we go on to the next slide, I've separated these barriers into different themes. There's often this real feeling from amongst parents of, if I use childcare, it shows I'm a bad parent, that parents are very worried about the judgment that might come from using childcare. I think that's an inevitable part, again, of being a parent, that you feel like you're about to be judged for everything you do. Every decision, somebody will think it's a good one, somebody will think it's a bad one, and you're stuck about what will people think of me. So some of the things that we've heard from parents I've put on in the speech. People think I'm lazy. Childcare's bad for parents. It's my job to look after him. What we know, what we've been talking about, is there are huge benefits to children of using childcare, both in terms of what happens at the childcare to help to support children's development, and as well as giving that time for parents to help. I know personally, I'm a much better mother when I've had a little break from my daughter. It helps me to rejuvenate myself and be a good parent. But also there are all these benefits to children's outcomes that we see from using childcare. But that doesn't mean that's not a real feeling that parents are going to have, that they're going to want to talk about and explore and feel, have that space to think about what that means for them. The next barrier that I've put on here is around information. Jo just did a heroic job of going through all the information that's out there around childcare. It is a complex system, isn't it? No wonder parents often struggle to know about what they're entitled to, what's out there for them. Quite often parents just take the key messages of childcare is expensive, it's only for working parents, and won't really know much more beyond that. Other parents might know a little bit about the free childcare offer, but not everything. So we'll still have some misconceptions about whether it's there. For example, that they might think it's just for nurseries or just for school nurseries, and not realise that quite the range of places where they can use that offer, and particularly if they would prefer a smaller setting. Or they might find that they've always assumed that they would use it at one setting, and when they find out there aren't places available at that setting, they suddenly feel like, oh, I don't know where to go from here, I don't know where to start. It's a really difficult journey to finding the right childcare. And that can be particularly true for children with special educational needs and disabilities, that finding out that information about whether they're entitled to free childcare, what extra support will be in place for them when they attend a setting, can be quite tricky. So there's an important role that you can play just by telling them about free childcare. I would really echo what Jo and James have been saying about that is a lot of information. It can't be any one person's job to pass all of that on to parents. You don't need to know that. You just need to know somebody who does know it. So to know where to signpost parents to. And this is something we say to parent champions all the time. Don't worry about remembering everything and knowing everything. Just know where parents can go to get their questions answered. And that will help with that information barrier. One of the things, again, that I think is particularly important is to consider extra barriers that parents might have to finding the information. And the key one that we see for that is that everything is written in English. And if you don't have digital access, or you can't read English, that's a real barrier for communication. A lot of our parent champions are bilingual and will do outreach in their home language, which is a really helpful way of doing it. We've also found it can be helpful to have resources in other languages, so leaflets in other languages, or short videos to explain the childcare offer in other languages. So if that's something that you have access to and are able to do, that can be a real winner, I think, for helping to reach more families. So if we go on to the next set of barriers. Wow, this is a huge one. Cultural barriers. It includes so many things within this. I think the key part of it is that we are all influenced in some way or another by our friends, families, people we meet, and we will all have different influences affecting our choices, and parenting decisions will be particularly influenced. Childcare is one of those. There are going to be some particular cultural barriers that I'll talk about a bit more, but one of the main ones that I've put on there is simply, I don't know anyone that uses childcare. If it's not something that's common within your social group, your family, it can feel really strange and mysterious, and like just it can feel, that can make it very hard to cross that threshold and go into a childcare setting. If it's just not something that you've spoken to other people about, it makes it feel much more scary. But there can also be some more negative messages that come from childcare about from family, from friends. One of the quotes I've put on here is, in my culture, extended family help look after each other's children, not nurseries, or my family won't approve. And there can be quite a lot of pressure about childcare being viewed as a bad thing amongst some cultures. One of the things that we've done through Parent Champions is to recruit parent volunteers from communities who are less likely to use childcare. And what that does is provide a positive role model of somebody that's relatable, who has had a positive experience. And it helps to really pass on that message of, oh, childcare can be for someone like me. It can be for any parent, it can be for any child. And if you can think about ways that you could replicate that within your role, if you're able to share stories from different families that you've worked with, or different colleagues who've had different experiences, that can be a helpful way of trying to break down those barriers to see that it's there for everyone. Yeah, I feel like there was something else I was going to say on that, but I don't know what it was. So I'll go on to the next slide and might come back to some more on cultural barriers in a moment. Separate from that, so what I just talked about, there was some quite negative messaging about childcare is not a good thing. There is also a group of parents who say, oh, your childcare's great, it's really good, just not for my child. Children do all come with unique personalities and unique set of needs, and for some it can be really hard to picture that child within childcare. Parents might think their child's too young, the child might really struggle with separation from the parent, being left at childcare, or child can have, so I put there, my child has SEND, childcare just won't be able to support her. The key thing for this is, and James and Jo both mentioned this already, don't have to use the full 15 hours. And if you start using childcare, it's not forever. If it doesn't work, you can stop. It's something that can be a good thing to try for families, and they don't have to commit to it forever. it is worth talking about the extra things that can be put in place for children with special educational needs and disabilities, the extra financial support that's there for settings so that they can make adjustments and meet needs, and also the experts that are there working in childcare settings. These are qualified professionals who are experienced and who have dealt with a wide range of different SEND needs, both diagnosed and undiagnosed. And sometimes it can be really helpful for parents to hear more about that, to speak to settings, to understand what children they've worked with in the past, and how that's been, how it's worked, whether it's been positive, whether it's been negative, what they've been able to do. And that will help parents to make an informed decision about whether it could be right for their own children. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I've talked about some of this already, but I wanted to just go through a few things, a few tips in these last 2 slides about what it is that works for parents in helping to change their minds. So I think the first point I put on there is recognising that barriers are real and legitimate. This is a difficult decision for parents. It's a big parenting decision. It's not as simple as if they know it's there, they'll immediately go, yes, please. I mean, some parents will. Some parents, the minute they find out, they go, wow, yes, right, that's what I want. But other ones, it will be a bit more tricky, that they'll need to think through what the different options are, which providers they could use, see how it will work for their family. And they all need a bit of space and time to think about those. But these barriers can also all be overcome. There are, we know a lot from today about the benefits of childcare. It is something that does end up working for the vast majority of families. And so focusing on the benefits for the child is really important. That's going to be what parents see as most important. It can, and linking into that, seeing childcare as part of the wider education system is really important. And this, I mentioned this earlier about, do we say childcare or do we say early education? Childcare is very commonly understood by parents. We all kind of know a bit about what childcare is. The free offer is called Free Early Education Entitlement. It is viewed as part of the education system. The reason government fund it is because it helps with children's outcomes. And so with some families, it makes a really big difference whether you call it childcare or whether you call it early education. And parent champions often vary which one they use depending on who they're talking to and which one works. Early education can definitely really appeal to some families, particularly some BAME groups. Using personal stories can also be great. I've just actually seen in the chat that somebody said she started to tidy up her toys, which I assume is something that came from early education. Things like that can be gold dust, and actually, oh, I get that. I can imagine my child doing that. Oh, wouldn't that be lovely if she started tidying up her toys? And those things that might feel quite small are really nice examples that people can relate to and make a difference. So thank you Gemma for providing me with that as I was going. Another key thing is to be able to provide families with a route to reliable information. There's so much noise out there about what's available, what's not available, some information that's reliable, some that's less so, some that's opinion, some that's facts. So being able to link in, whether it's your family information services, the counsellor, if there's another team who can help parents through that journey of understanding what they're entitled to, what it could mean for them, where they can go and what they can do. And then linked into that is understanding what happens at childcare. I said for some families who don't know a lot of other families that have used childcare, it can feel quite mysterious and scary. So being able to talk just about the simple things about what happens at childcare. I said that linking it in with the education system can be really important, but then some parents often start thinking of that, oh, does that mean they sit at desks all day and they need to do writing, and are they going to be reciting times tables? But so really emphasising that what happens is learning through play, and that it's all about children having fun and learning at the same time, and how powerful play can be for children's development. Passing on the message about childcare workers being professional, qualified experts. Obviously, they are parents. They know their child better than anyone else, and they will be they'll have a unique role in supporting their child's development. However, it doesn't mean there isn't a place for other people to be involved, and particularly within childcare, it is people who know about children's early development and things that I don't know. You know, I can see my child goes to a childminder. I can see the things that they do with her are so powerful in her development. And I've worked in the field of early years for 5 years now. You'd have thought I thought I knew it, but there's a trained professional knows things and knows how to help support children's development in a different way. It's not a better way, it's just a different way. And to help break down those barriers about childcare being a normal, acceptable, and even good thing. So these are all things that can help change parents' minds. A point that I think I was meant to make earlier is recognising that part of the reason Parent Champions work is they're only ever part of a picture around promoting the 2-year-old offer. You can play a really powerful role with families, but you don't have to do it all yourself. There'll be leaflets in children's centres, mail outs to parents' homes, posters at bus stops. There are all different ways that parents are hearing about childcare. No one person can take all the burden of this. What tends to work is hearing the message from several different people at several different times, having an opportunity to have different conversations with different people. And that can be, it's part of a journey. It's never all on one thing or one person. It's part of a journey to understand how it could work for your family. And then I've got one final slide, which is just going through again, just finally some of these tips for talking about childcare. Taking time to understand individual barriers. I talked about cultural barriers in particular. They do exist, but we can't assume that because somebody's from a particular community, they have the same barriers as someone else from that community. It's about taking the time to see where a parent's at and what are the things that they're concerned about. I said, know your limits. We can't all be Joe Pringle. We can't all go through that level of detail on childcare entitlements, but we can signpost people on to find out more information. And that's something that we emphasise again and again to Parent Champions. Personal stories are really effective. We're all going to be thinking about that 2-year-old tidying up their toys. That's a nice image of what kind of learning and development can happen in early education settings. I've talked already about early education might be a better choice of phrase from childcare. It might not be for other people. See what works. And then the final point is around using the message that resonates with you. Probably this morning, there'll be one thing that really sticks. I see that, that's a really important thing. I can see that makes a difference for families. If you're passionate about it, you can share that with other families and that will make a difference for them as well. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant, Megan. A really good segue from what Joe was sharing and to hear from that parent's perspective. I've got some questions for you and I'll probably bring Joe Pringle in as well for some of these questions. You've referred to it a few times in terms of the difference between early education and childcare. There have been chats and questions about these terms. They're terms that we use all the time in our day-to-day life. So if you, in a nutshell, how would you describe the difference between early years learning and education and childcare? Is there a difference, or what is the difference?
In Scotland, they refer to it all as early learning and care, which I love as a phrase. I think that that's really nice. I think the divide is quite artificial with young children between learning and care, as if the two happen separately. I don't see that. I think it's all, you need to care to learn, they go together to me, basically. Okay,
and Joe, what do you think?
I would absolutely agree with that, because while you are caring for a child, whatever sort of childcare provider you are, they are learning. And while they are learning, you are caring for them. And I think one of the lessons that we have learned, and some of us have been doing this for quite a long time, is around getting that message right, as Megan has said, that for some families we provide the childcare, and actually, attainment and educational outcomes might be the pull into taking up a place. But for other families, that won't be the thing that engages them with a place. So it's around understanding the different families, and selling the benefits, and many of them have been spoken about, to that family, using the right messaging that will work for that family, whether it's about tidying up toys or supporting English language, or you know, socialization. There are many messages that we'll think about as we go through this morning, but no, one and the same, and we get too bogged down with the terminology.
Well, I would agree. I mean, and one of my favourite phrases is that every experience in childcare is a learning experience. You know, children do not separate out childcare and learning. They are, I think most people realise the sponge-like qualities that young children have in their learning, and how massively fast they do learn at that age. I think what connects those two different descriptions is the policy intent. So 2-year-old funding is given to support early learning. 3- and 4-year-old universal funding, again, is about preschool education. 30 hours childcare is around supporting working parents. So the political policy that's attached, and the driver to the funding, sometimes causes us to use these terms, but we always advocate an approach that uses the learning, the childcare, and the social benefits interchangeably. There are some parts of community that have trends and prefer to hear about learning. Some prefer to hear about childcare. Those families who were able, willing, and able to return to work this year following being furloughed or in lockdown will have very much been focused on what their childcare needs were. Those families that have been in small housing under pressure with their children, maybe 2 or 3 under 5, will have been very focused about the need for their children to engage in social activities. Families that have observed this year their children, perhaps their learning not being as fast as it used to be, or feeling that they need to learn more and differently, will want to hear about the learning benefits of provision. So we need to use those terms interchangeably, and tailor them and differentiate them to the families that we're working with. And some of that may have changed. What might have been a motivator for a family before COVID might have been childcare. Now learning might be much more important, now that they've experienced supporting their children to learn at home or doing homeschooling with their older children. So these things do change massively. Back to Megan. The questions around, is Parent Champions a national programme? Where is it happening? How do people get in touch to find out more and connect with a Parent Champion scheme if there's one in that area? So that's like 4 questions in one.
So it is a national scheme. It's in 43 areas of the country at the moment, so it's not everywhere, but it can be. If you want to know more, please get in touch with me. I believe that my email address, well, I can put my email address in the chat, actually. That's probably the easiest thing to do, and it might go out with the papers afterwards. We are called Coram Family and so you can also Google us, and then there's lots of information online.
Coram Family and Childcare, that was. You just cut out at that key moment on my screen. So yes, I don't think your email address is on your slides, actually. So
no,
do.
So I'll put it in the chat just now. Yeah.
And you know, I like Megan's phrase, be more Pringle. So let's go back to Joe, because there's some technical questions here. What Ofsted, and it's like a quick pop quiz for you now, Joe. What Ofsted grading does a setting need to have to be able to offer this entitlement?
Any childcare provider who is good or outstanding can offer the 2-year-old entitlement. Ofsted is the sole arbitrator, whether they are, we've got an individual childminder, a small childminding business, or an extremely large chain. Good and outstanding is what's required for the 2-year-old. For sufficiency, local authorities can use providers that are .good and outstanding. If a provider delivering a 2-year-old place Ofsted grading changes, most local authorities will work with that provider and try and maintain the continuity rather than necessarily change things, but they may not support additional places being taken by that provider. So that's sort of a brief synopsis. Is that enough detail? That
Thank you. Thank you. So Joe, once a family is told that they are eligible for the 2-year-old entitlement and they start it, can it be taken away?
No. Unlike the 30 hours, which is based on an ongoing confirmation that circumstances haven't changed, the 2-year-old entitlement, once that place has been offered, is guaranteed and stays with the family. Doesn't matter how circumstances change through until the term after their 3rd birthday, when they would transition over into the universal entitlement or potentially the additional hours that come with the 30 hours if they're a family that meet that eligibility criteria. So no, it stays, not taken away, end of.
So even if their family circumstances change, once they're in 2-year-old provision, it stays until they transition into their universal entitlement.
It does indeed. I heard a local authority tell me once that even if a family had won the lottery, that was their example, circumstances, it stays.
Yeah, but that's different for 30 hours, isn't it?
It is. Families who meet the eligibility criteria have to apply for their 30-hour place. They then have to regularly, when prompted, confirm that their circumstances haven't changed. If circumstances don't change, then the eligibility criteria sustains and the place continues. If circumstances do change and a family is no longer eligible, within the system there's a period that's called the grace period that's built in, and that varies depending on the time of the year. But in essence, that grace period is there to do a number of things to ensure that there's some continuity for the child if family circumstances have changed, to support the parent with that continuity to maybe look for new work or re-engage with work, and to give the provider some assurance that the funding is there up until whenever date. When the grace period finishes, a family who were no longer eligible would return to that universal entitlement that everyone can have of the 570 hours or 15 hours over 38 weeks, if that's how they choose to take it.
Yes, I mean there was a couple of comments about the ability to stretch the offer, and I mean I use all sorts of analogies when I come to describing how parents can choose to use their hours if they can provide a setting that is able to do that. I sometimes say it's like the difference between spreading jam on a slice of bread and spreading Marmite on a slice of bread. You spread it thinner. It's a very bad analogy, I've just come to realise.
Yeah, but no, I know what you mean. I suppose in essence, not everyone's lives work in weeks, in term times, in school weeks and in 38 weeks. You know, we have families who have part-time work, who work all year round. We have full-time working families. We have families who, you know, family circumstances are as diverse as the childcare market. So by stretching, what it enables a family to do is to take their 570 hours and to make it look something different, so a smaller amount of hours per week over a longer time. So off the top of my head, I can tell you that 570 hours, if you split it over a full-time nursery place for 51 weeks, is just over 11 hours. But some providers will offer provision for maybe 47.5 weeks, and then that looks like 12 hours. Now, there are benefits for families of stretching. One benefit is that it provides a consistent throughout the year, so that when they're looking at their claims, they're not going up and down. So at holiday time, their circumstances aren't changing. They've got no big bills to pay because, you know, take a 30-hour example. If you take 30 hours for 38 weeks and you have to pay 30 hours a week for the summer holidays, that's a big bill. But if that's prorated across, a family is paying the additional 8 hours, say, each week, which is more manageable than finding a big amount. And it means that children are engaged in education, early learning, childcare, whichever we choose to call it, for a longer period, and there's no gaps in that as well. Now, it will depend on what a provider can do, but families shouldn't be afraid to ask for something different. Rather than having to find childcare arrangements over the summer holidays, many providers do offer it across the year, so that monthly bill looks different, or looks the same month by month, rather than different in term time and holidays.
Okay, thank you. And no apologies, I'm going to ask you a killer question now,
Oh no,
Joe, and then I'll give you a break. It's the whole difference between free and funded and top-up fees. People have been commenting on this on the chat, and understand we've been using the phrase that the government is funding the entitlement, but of course you've talked about the ways in which there's extra support to pay for additional fees. I mean, what's the simple message to people about the difference between free and funded?
The government funding pays for the early education and that childcare part of the day. Providers can, in the statutory guidance, charge for additional hours, so anything in a day up and above what is classed as they're funded. And providers do different things. Providers can set their own model. But on top of that, many providers will charge for additional services, whether they be trips, for food. They're just modeled slightly differently. I think the key thing is that parents and providers, that initial dialogue that families and providers have, needs to really be clear and set out what is the government paying for, and what will be the expectation of what a parent will pay for, whether that be hours, additional services. And what that looks like will look very different. There are many providers who continue to offer standalone funded places, but in other places, based on their costs, their business models, there will be additional charges. But the transparency and the clarity right at the very beginning. Somebody's just asked, so no food is included. It really depends on the individual provider. Most local authorities, when working with their providers, will ask providers to take a common sense approach to what are barriers to families. And we have to think about the individual cohorts. A working family buying an additional 20 hours a week is potentially in a different position to a family of a 2-year-old, of a family who isn't working. So it's that common sense approach. Some people will include snacks and food because they can make their costs and their business model work. Some providers don't. It's about that upfront being really clear at the beginning what that might mean, and having that common sense approach possible.
Okay, thank you. And there's been another question which I will answer, so take the pressure off you, Joe. Is that people have asked if there are resources to download. Well, certainly if you go onto the Childcare Choices website and into the professionals area, you will be able to find all sorts of downloadable leaflets and posters and social media assets as well. But I would also urge anybody to, if you're not already, to get in touch with your local authority early years team. And some local authorities still run a families information service or a similar service, because they will have their own information as well that will describe local processes if you work in an area that that matches their local authority district. and their websites, of course, as well. And I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunity for good conversations to be had to share that knowledge and share that partnership working. I know that most early years and childcare teams in local authorities that I know would be delighted to receive phone calls and contacts from colleagues in Job Centre Plus and in health visiting and in others. Was that your hand up, Joe?
It was. I just wanted to come back. I noticed there was a question. What I didn't say in that charging bit was that, you know, most providers will provide parents with the option of bringing packed lunch or an alternative where food is being charged. Just that I realised I didn't cover that and the question was raised.
Okay, thank you for picking that up. Now we're rattling quickly towards break, but I want to do two things. I want to set out the challenge for part 2, which is about focusing on all of our roles and how we make sense of all of that detail and context and put it into practice in terms of good reach and motivating behaviours. But Nikki Hirsch from Islington put on the chat, are we going to talk about the COVID-19 context? Well, actually, yes, and we're going to do that now. So if I just bring up the next slide for you. We've talked about, Megan did a wonderful job of talking about barriers and thoughts and responses, and some of the chat we've seen has added value and added detail and content to that. But it won't surprise you to know and to hear that over the past, well, nearly 12 months, we've been doing nothing more than supporting early years and childcare settings to make sense of the challenge and change that have been presented by the impacts of the pandemic. And like I was saying earlier, in terms of how that might change the motivators for families, they may move from a learning motivator to a childcare one, or a social one to a learning one. All of these things can affect the supply and demand in the sector, but they really do need to be put into context and understood, especially because families have the right to choose what they want to do within the context of a lockdown and their own personal and their family's safety. So many of these factors, as described on this slide, are currently impacting on the take-up of early years entitlements. We know, and there's a considerable and understandable level of anxiety amongst parents and families and the workforce in childcare, it has to be said. There's worries about risk of transmission and the potential impact of COVID on some populations and demographics, and we expect this to be more acute in some communities. Also, we know that many parents, not all, but many, are working from home. But for these, early years provision might support them to work at home in different ways. For parents that are furloughed or unemployed, there may be much less of a motivation to take up a 2-year-old place or a childcare place, especially if there are extra costs involved. Particularly for those new to the entitlement, people are waiting to see what might happen next before perhaps they are going to be engaging with provision. We've lost 3 terms already of full early years and childcare provision since the pandemic. So the effects on that do create an urgency for us, for those of us who really want to help children's preschool learning and to support families to reconcile work and family life. But speaking to colleagues across the country, we work with every single local authority in England about reach and engagement. It's clear that the ways in which we traditionally outreach to eligible families and other activities that usually drive take-up have been curtailed. Usually, local authorities will get a list of potentially eligible families, make contact with them by sending a postcard or a letter, or even knocking on the door to say, we think you're eligible, can we help you to take up your place? So things like children's centre activities and other professional roles who may be visiting homes or holding group sessions, not so much as that has been happening this year. So our attention has been diverted to COVID-19 requirements. Take-up remains relatively buoyant of the 2-year-old entitlement across the country, but on average, but in some areas it's really plummeted. It's gone down, you know, the national average is in the 60s, the 60% area. In January, we were about 69%. It's gone down a little bit from that, but in some areas it can be dramatically lower than that. But of course, we know that providers are having to balance and reconcile their issues around staffing levels, including their own staff anxieties and shielding and isolating. And that might potentially impact on a setting's ability to maintain their provision and certainly the quality of their provision. We know that support services for children with SEND, for example, portage, speech and language, may not have been able to access the same support, provide the same support that they might have done in the past. So there'll be a great urgency when things start to return to any sort of normal to catch up with those children's needs. When Ofsted did a provider survey in November, they found many children had left their early years and childcare setting in the first lockdown and hadn't yet come back. And providers were reporting to Ofsted that the learning and development of children was being significantly impacted, especially around children's personal, social and emotional development. But it's also about income as well. Providers are highly anxious about the income throughout the pandemic. Yes, they've been able to use furlough, and yes, some government funding has continued as normal. But with lower levels of demand, particularly for paid for provision, as families seem to be requiring less childcare, moving around less, and perhaps being able to work and balance shorter working and family days, then all providers are having to relook at their finances and re-business plan in a fit for purpose way in the current market. It might be that some providers therefore prioritise 3- and 4-year-olds as their most cost-effective way of sustaining their businesses. So the ability for us to place 2-year-olds may be even more challenging, not impossible, but certainly different. And what we find is that children eligible for 2-year-olds, because they're disadvantaged or least advantaged children, often the areas in which they live means that the providers that are locally available do rely on government funding. So the importance of getting children into government funded places is important for the long-term sustainability of the sector. Lots of different considerations there in terms of the impacts of the pandemic. But let's return to today's challenge and the next slide. And how do we put a framework on engaging families for 2021? So the next part of today's session is going to focus on what you could do and what others could do to support this minefield of information. You know, we've learned that timing is everything. Children and families need to know about their entitlements at the time that's right for them. And the importance of trusted message givers is vital, and you could be that trusted message giver. We've heard about parent-to-parent communication, but we all have different attitudes to who we trust and who we listen to in terms of the message. You might be the 4th or 5th message giver on this issue before a parent, well, I think Megan said that, before the penny drops and action from idea to take up is triggered. The process, as we have heard, can be complicated, and there are all sorts of necessary checks and safeguards and barriers that we need to support the parent through their journey from idea to take up. These are all our challenges for part 2. And what we will look at is what works and some ideas and asks to enable us all to do that. So next slide shows you, this is what the question, what could you do? And that's what we're going to answer in part 2. It really is our challenge to you. What is your role in influencing decisions? And how can we reconcile the personal versus the professional? What about our views of childcare? It's an emotive issue. We've heard about the emotional response from parents. Some of you may have worked when your children were small and some stayed at home. You may have strong views about children being in childcare. But let's think about whatever our personal views and how we've established those in our role. How can we be confident message givers and motivators so that parents and families can make the choices that we think are right for them and that they think are right for them as well? Okay, so it's approaching 11:10. We said we'd break at about 11:15, so we will break for 10 minutes now, well-earned break, and after break we will hear from DWP. We have Julie Abbott and we have Alison Morton from the Institute of Health Visiting to look at the perspectives of Job Centre Plus colleagues and health visitors in that. And we'll consider what we can all do, whatever our role, to make that small bit of difference. So thank you very much, and we will see you in 10 minutes. Okay, I'm afraid that 10-minute break is already over. I hope you made best use of it. We have another hour or so to complete today's webinar, and I'm really pleased that our next speaker is Julie Abbott, who's the Senior National Account Manager and Childcare Lead at the Department for Work and Pensions. And I said at the beginning today that this webinar was funded by DFE, and it's part of a project that we are running between November 2020 and the end of March 21. And on day one, they said I must speak with Julie to connect this work with what DWP are doing. And so on day two, I did, and it's been a very fruitful and beneficial working relationship, I have to say. We're very grateful to DWP's support of this project and how Julie has been connecting Job Centre Plus colleagues with local authority early years colleagues as well, and of course agreeing to present today and to promote today's event to her colleagues as well. So Julie, it's over to you.
Thank you, James. That was quite a build up, wasn't it? Okay, so I'd just like to clarify at first, in the first instance, that although I am classed as a childcare lead, that doesn't make me an expert on all the intricacies of the different eligibilities and offers and so on. So please don't post questions to me about that. My role is more of, if you like, a relationship manager. So if we go on to the next slide.
Julie, I've noticed that your camera's been on all morning, but now that you're about to speak, your camera's not on. I don't know if you're able to switch it off.
I turned it off during the break. There we
are.
There you go. Back on now. Brilliant. I do apologise. Okay, so because DWP is such a large organisation and we do so many different things, I thought it might be helpful to just maybe outline a couple of the key roles and the structure of DWP so that people can actually get a feel for where there is a touch point with the childcare agenda. So I'm going to apologise to my colleagues who I know are on the line from DWP, because they will know this, but this is for the benefit of people that maybe do not. So my role is to engage and build relationships with key external experts that can support DWP in building the childcare knowledge they need. So the knowledge they need to be able to advise the customers that we come in contact with on a daily basis. And what I do is I work with these organisations to identify information and resources that already exists. And then I will obviously communicate those resources to our frontline work coaches. So our work coaches are the guys that sit in job centres and under normal circumstances have customers sitting in front of them talking about their job aspirations and so on. I mean, we're doing everything remotely now, but still those conversations are going on. So it's up to me to make sure that those work coaches are furnished with the information, support, resources they need to have those childcare conversations. On occasions, you know, we find that there's actually a gap in those resources, and I'll also work with partners to develop bespoke resources as requested by work coaches. So at the end of the day, what we want work coaches to be able to do is to be confident and comfortable to advise their customers on how to choose the right provision for their children and how to access funding. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, please. So I've just mentioned our work coaches, and for those of you that are not familiar, I think it's important to just cover their role. If I'm honest, they are the engine of DWP. They are the front-facing, face of DWP. That part of the business we call Job Centre Plus. So DWP is the kind of overarching company. Job Centre Plus is the bit where the work coaches sit in job centres, seeing customers every day. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of them, as you could imagine, and we're recruiting even more at the moment because of, COVID giving us an increased unemployment register. So we need enough work coaches to handle all those extra customers that we're seeing. So the work coach reason for being, if you like, is to support people into work by helping them identify their key job skills, helping them to improve their CVs if necessary, helping them, directing them to places where they can get interview technique, support, and that sort of stuff, and advising them about the local labour market and where opportunities might be. But in addition to that, they take a holistic approach to the individual, and sometimes individuals are not ready to go into work immediately because they have other barriers and challenges that they may need to deal with first. And the work coach again would advise people on any number of different barriers or challenges and refer them to the right support organisations. So one of the barriers for our customers may very well be childcare. So some of our parents that are our customers may lack confidence in trusting the care of their child to a stranger. They may not be aware of the range of childcare options. They might have concerns about funding. So obviously, if that's a barrier to someone entering employment, we need our work coaches to be able to point our customers in the right direction and get the right help and support. Okay, next slide, please. Again, just talking about our structure, this is how Job Centre Plus is organised, and this is really, I've given this demonstration just so that anybody that's listening that's an external partner who might want to engage with DWP and Job Centre Plus, they understand that there is kind of a tiered structure. So as I said, I sit at national level, but DWP is divided into 8 groups. And underneath each of those groups, there is a varying number of districts. Our total districts in England at the moment is 28, or it was last time I watched, but that seems to change daily. So, but you get the general idea. Okay, so moving on. So every district, so we just said there were 28 districts across England, also has a childcare champion. And the childcare champion role was really put in place to help with the communication and the landing of information and resources. So, I'm doing my piece of work at the national level, engaging with various external partners, gathering up information and so on. But we need a way to make sure that that is channeled down into each district. And as I explained before, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of work coaches. So we kind of need a single point of contact who will work with me to land that information and resources. So the childcare champions help me to gather information from work coaches. So, we can talk about where their gaps in knowledge might be. And if childcare champion is already aware of something that can address that gap, then obviously they'll point them in the right direction. But obviously, if it's a gap that is not being met, that will be fed back to me at the national level. And we try to look at a way to create resources to support. They also help me, childcare champions help me to quality assure any new resources that are being developed. So we'll often go out for consultation and say, does this look right to you? What would you change, etc., etc. As I said, they take receipt of information that we've developed, but they also build local relationships with appropriate external partners for themselves. and they arrange support and events for parents in partnership with external partners. Okay, next slide, please. So I just wanted to give some examples of some of the activity that is would be going on in job centres, around job centres under normal circumstances. As rightly pointed out, you know, we're having to move to some more kind of inventive ways of doing some of these things and virtual delivery. But for instance, we will have in some places Job Centre Plus members of staff going out to children's centres, where they will talk to the parents in those children's centres and discuss with them options for work or study. We have jobs fairs specifically for parents, and what we try to do with those is we try to bring on a local childcare expert organisation, so that at the same time as looking at job options, they've got someone on hand to advise them immediately with the childcare support available. We have Childcare Ready to Choose booklet, which was Pacey introduced us to. Pacey is one of our external partners that we work with quite closely at all levels, and we've got a kind of a, if you like, a regular reorder of those booklets, because those booklets are things that we find really supportive in discussions with parents. So we're making sure that, you know, our publications are up to date and we've got information on hand to share. And the final bullet on there, but this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure that I've got loads of colleagues on the line out there that could add additional best practice. We've recently started working with Pacey around delivering virtual information sessions to our work coaches. So by way of training the work coaches and giving them the information they need to advise their customers, we've been doing a series of those via Teams meetings. Okay, so if we can just move on. So I wanted to sort of put a bit of a health warning on everything I've just said, and I'm sure that there are DWP colleagues on the line saying, well, that's not right, or we don't do that, or somebody else does something else, and whatever. Although we have a single childcare champion in each district, we also have other members of staff that have other roles that might cross over with the childcare agenda. So it's not a one size fits all. The childcare champion is not a full-time role. It's not their sole, you know, their sole day job. And so it depends very much on the district they belong to and the resourcing and so on as to how much time they actually allocate to that piece of work. So in a very, very basic level, they may just be the single point of contact for me to land new resources and for me to communicate with work coaches. It may be as simple as that. However, they may also be, as I said before, organising specific events for our customers that are parents. They may be engaging with the external partners and building relationships there. They may have a relationship with the local authority. It very much depends on, you know, as I say, the need of the district and the time available for them to carry out that childcare champion role. In all districts, we also have a partnership manager. So, you know, in some cases, it might actually be the partnership manager that is doing that kind of external relationship bit. So it might actually be the partnership manager who is engaging with childcare partners. But I guess what I wanted to say was the childcare champion is a very, very good starting point. So I think the best thing to do is, if you have a will to engage with your local JCP, I think, you know, the childcare champion would be where you would start. Have the discussion about, you know, what you want to get from the relationship, and then the childcare champion would be the person to point you in the right direction if in fact it is a different colleague that would be more appropriate. And I've actually given James a full list of our childcare champions. So he has those mapped against local authorities. So if anybody needs the details of their childcare champion, then James has them. So I think that's it for me. So really just, James, do you want me to take questions?
We'll do some questions after Alison has spoken as well. So I'll give you a bit of a breathing space. There are a few. You might, in fact, you might want to have a look at the chat whilst Alison's speaking to see what questions have come up during that time. But that's really fantastic. And as you said, we are busy connecting childcare champions to early years and childcare teams in local authorities. One of the things that we're doing alongside this national webinar is a series of regional webinars for local authority teams to do that and many other things. So hopefully we've started a great deal of conversations on business relationships, and I'm sure everybody's thinking about how those relationships and the task ahead might unfold over the next months and perhaps years in terms of the opportunity for more partnership working. So thank you very much, Julie. Next up, we have Alison Morton, who's the Acting Executive Director of the Institute of Health Visiting. And I think, you know, we've said a lot today about the benefits of the entitlements of childcare, of learning for children and families. But of course, this part too is about how the entitlements help us all to achieve our goals at work. You know, how we can develop solutions for families' learning, for family stability and plans, for health, for unemployment and employment, and for children's development. So it'll be no surprise to you that Alison's going to focus on the health perspective. So over to you, Alison.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction, James, and it's lovely to be here with everybody. I've been watching the chat and really enjoying the presentation so far. So as James said, my presentation is really focusing on how we improve the uptake of the two-year offer, but focusing specifically on the role of the health visiting service. Do you want to move on to the next slide, please? So really just three key messages, really. A lot of people say, what do health visitors do? I think there's a bit of an understanding by most people, but I thought I'd just spend a bit of time covering that, about how we improve outcomes for children. And then look at this whole system approach that's needed to improve the uptake of the two-year offer. And many contributors this morning have said, we all do our little bits, but actually if we all work together, we can achieve so much more. And health visitors work with all families, but most specifically, I think their role here is to improve uptake for the most disadvantaged families. So if you move on to the next slide. I put this slide in really just to remind us why we're here today, why we get out of bed in the morning, most of us, for children like these. I love working with young children. I've done it for all my career. And these aren't two-year-olds in this picture, you'll have guessed that. But it's a reminder that all children have hopes and aspirations. Actually, when you're little, you dream of being everything. Nothing is impossible when you're a child. I love the idea of believing you can go into space wearing flip-flops, actually. But actually what we do know is that some children are much more likely to achieve their aspirations than others. And we know disadvantage starts early, the effects are cumulative, and they can last a lifetime and pass from one generation to the next. And it's our role together really to support families to break that cycle. But not only children have aspirations, so do parents. As a health visitor working with many, many parents, I never met a single one actually who didn't want the best start in life for their children. And yet, as a health visitor, I also recognise that there are thousands of reasons why life doesn't work out the way we hoped. And for many parents, we need a bit of support at some points in our life. And for some parents, they need an awful lot more support to get back on track. And that's where the health visiting service comes into play. So if we move on to the next slide. We've heard a lot this morning about how different government departments work together, so DWP, DFE, and now we're going to focus on the Department of Health, which is where health visitors money comes from. Funding for health visiting comes through the Department of Health and Social Care. It flows through Public Health England and into local authorities and funds the Public Health Grant. And health visitors lead the delivery of the Healthy Child Programme, which is a programme of early intervention and prevention for children. It includes, amongst other things, child health surveillance, screening, health reviews, immunisations and health promotion. I put some references in if any of you are interested. It was last updated in 2009 and it's just being updated now, but I'm going to speak to where we're at with it at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide. I don't know how you feel when you look at the state of childcare and provision in England particularly. Do you look at it with a glass half full or a glass half empty? And the truth is they're both true. On the one hand, we have a huge number of opportunities, and James has already alluded to this in his introduction. We have more evidence than any other generation that the early years lay the foundation for lifelong health and well-being. We know enough about what works to make a difference now, and we know that investment in the early childhood is a smart investment, and you get the greater the return, the greater your investment. It's much easier to fix problems at the beginning than to deal with large problems at the end, you know, as they grow over time. We also know through the work of Marmot that inequalities are not inevitable. And early intervention really does make a difference. But as a health visitor, I'd also propose that health visitors are an opportunity. They're a highly skilled workforce, specialist community public health nurses who can address numerous government priorities for children and families. Health visitors work with both the adult and the child in the context of the home and the environment in which they live. And they straddle all three levels of vulnerability. So Department for Education and Health got together recently and redefined vulnerability. So depending on what lens you look at it, whether it's through the education lens, so you're thinking of children with special educational needs and disabilities, or looked after children, children on child protection plans, or maybe through the lens of the health vulnerabilities, which is children with clinical conditions or complex needs. And then the wider determinants of health, which is what Public Health England are interested in, which are all those other factors that can impact outcomes for children. So health visitors will work with all families, but also offer increased support to families with high levels of need. Can we move to the next slide? I don't want to dwell on this slide. I want to stay positive, but we can't ignore the challenges. So I'm not going to go through all of these. We have multiple challenges in this country in terms of how we support our children. We have widening inequalities and a poor state of child health and well-being compared to many other countries across Europe. The Children's Commissioner in 2019 highlighted that 2.3 million children live with risk because of family and environmental factors, and of those, a third are invisible, and particularly young children, babies and young children are the most invisible because they're not accessing school and get the support through the school provision that others get. We know just the way that the service is funded at the moment that there's huge unwarranted variation in the quality of health visiting services that families get. And I'll just end on the last one. The cost of failing to intervene is actually enormous. Should we move on to the next slide? So this is the slide which says what do health visitors do actually. A lot of people in the early years sector focus predominantly on the two purple chevrons across the top, intervention and improving outcomes, which are hugely important, and there's lots of evidence behind all of those. But health visitors will want to look at the whole system. So to make early intervention work, we have to, well, firstly, prevent problems from happening in the first place, but then early identification. So this overlaps this 2-year offer issue, finding the families that will be eligible. Then brokering engagement. Many health visitors and many of you listening today will know that some of the most vulnerable families are not queuing up saying, I'd really love to join an intervention. There's a whole load of reasons why families don't engage, and some of those have been covered already. For some families living with some of these issues highlighted in those concentric circles below, there's a lot of stigma and shame, fear, worry that people are going to spot that they're a bad parent, whatever that means. Take their children into care is the biggest worry that families often tell us that they have. And so the health visitor, it really is a brokering role to do that. In the circles down below, what I've done is I've listed 15 areas where health visitors can make a big difference. They're all costing the government a fortune. So the government spend £23 billion a year to cover the cost of child neglect and perinatal mental health problems, which both impact on child outcomes. And that's just 2 of the 15. I won't cover the cost of the others. They're all socially driven. And there are widening inequalities between the least and the most advantaged children. And for many families, a lot of these factors will coexist. So you have one, you'll often have another as well. So the health visitor's job is to really focus upstream and to be that brokering role for these families. We can move to the next slide. So what I thought I would do now is just try to bring this to life. One of our earlier speakers talked about how stories bring things to life, really. The 2-year offer is not a new intervention. I was very lucky many years ago. I worked in Salisbury as a health visitor and was on one of the pilot sites. And really had my eyes open to this fabulous offer available to families. At the time when they brought in the pilot, there was a lot of I guess, anxiety amongst some people who thought maybe the money would be better off spent on parents and supporting parenting. You know, if parents needed support with that, well, why weren't people just going into their homes to support them there? But actually I had my eyes open through this case study I'm going to tell you about why it really does matter. So my role, I was the designated health visitor for a number of early years settings in Salisbury. And as a caseload holder, I had a number of vulnerable families on my caseload. So it was really just joining the dots, really. I had a foot in both camps, as it were. The family I'm going to talk about, I'd known them for more than 2 years. The mother was alcohol dependent, quite serious problems with alcohol, which influenced her capacity to care for her children. But she you know, had support and was managing of a sort at home. Her little boy, who was coming up for 2, he had fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. At the time, we had a hunch that there might be some developmental delay, but we weren't exactly sure. His home environment could best be described as chaotic, I suppose. There were very few boundaries, and the mother was really struggling to manage her own needs alongside the needs of her child. So I guess my role as the health visitor was that brokering role. We had a relationship of trust. She trusted me. I'd worked with her for a while, talked to her about this new initiative, brokered her engagement with the early years setting provider. I worked with a fabulous nursery in Salisbury and run by an amazing woman who really took to heart the needs of these vulnerable children and arranged a visit for this mum to go and visit. And anyway, helped her to fill in all the application forms to get the funding sorted. And the little boy started. I used to visit this nursery probably every month or 6 weeks. And I remember going to visit on a day when he was there. And all the children in this nursery wore the same little red sweatshirt. And the great thing was I arrived at playtime and I saw this little chap charging around with all his friends in his little red sweatshirt. And for all intents and purposes, you couldn't spot him amongst all the other children. They all broadly looked the same. They were all 2-year-olds having a great time. And it really cemented in me that for that little boy, it gave him some time away with some structured play, some free play, socializing with others. What it also did for his mother was gave her time to focus on her own issues and to get support in place to help her. So a real godsend for this family. He did have developmental needs, and by being in the early years setting, the SENCO was able to get alongside him, develop a plan of support specific for his needs, which then carried right through to him transitioning into school as he got older. But it was really his first step into the education setting. It was learning through play, and he had a fabulous time. So that won me over, and I'm a huge supporter of it. And I know many health visitors out there are supporting families to get that same level of support. Should we move on to the next slide? So just moving on, how can health visitors support families? So for those of you, I'm sure many of you are aware, health visitors in England, their priorities is to improve access, experience and outcomes for children. They deliver 5 mandated health reviews to all families, but that really isn't it. That is just the gateway, the entry into the service, because they also offer extra support for the families who need it at various times for what they need. So for each of those 5 contexts, the 2 that are really relevant is obviously the 1 and the 2-year review. I would argue that the 1-year review is probably the most important to identify children that might be eligible and start to have a conversation with parents about the process. When I was a health visitor, and I know many health visitors do, they then flag children on their caseload that would be eligible and make a note to get in touch with them about 3 months before the child turns 2 in order to get all the paperwork sorted and to find a setting. So the child can start when they're 2. If you leave it till they're 2 or 2.5, by the time you've sorted the process out, they've lost half of the offer. So that would be certainly one suggestion. If we move on to the next slide. So this really sets out what we consider to be the main contribution of the health visitor. So as we've said already, health visitors are just part of the solution, but this is how health visitors can help. The first is through the early identification of eligible families, as I've said. signposting them to information and the eligibility criteria. I don't know about you, but listening to the speakers this morning, I mean, I was just reminded how confusing it really is on one level. I know there's loads of people out there to help families, but if you maybe aren't very familiar with the system before, this is your first child, it can feel like go on the too hard to do pile for many parents. So it's great to hear the examples of support that are out there, and health visitors working in practice will know all their local support networks, whether that's the Family Information Service or the Parent Champions, if you're lucky enough to work in an area where they have those. So signposting all families who are eligible to that. But thirdly, brokering engagement for those families who have vulnerabilities that will be entitled through that cohort. I've touched on that already. So important for children who've got DLA, children who are care leavers, that for those who have asylum in the UK, the health visitors will know all of these families, so can have their radar up to support them. But also this safety net for vulnerable children, because we know that some of these families move around a lot. And you might get entitlement in one place and then you move to another area and you fall out the system. So it's supporting families to find new early years settings to use their offer when they move. Health visitors will be made aware of families when they move in and out of different areas. And somebody said to me, well, actually it was Andrea Ledson, actually, she said the health visitors are the glue, and I really liked it for the early years support, because they are those eyes and the ears on the ground, particularly during COVID. We know we've got lots of families who've been tipped into vulnerability who may be eligible now for this offer and maybe weren't aware in the past. And finally, future opportunities. We're always talking about improving our digital offer and the use of analytics and data to flag children who might be eligible, sharing information across local authorities. Obviously takes interoperability and data sharing agreements, but I know they're in place in some areas and they can certainly support this offer for families. So really that was all from me, just to say that, it's been fabulous to be here this morning and to listen. We all have bits of the solution for these families and to work together. And I guess just to leave you with the thought that health visitors are part of that solution. If you're working in local areas, to make use of your health visitors and get in touch with them if you're worried about any families. Thank you. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Alison. Brilliant. And I'll extend the same invitation to you to peruse the chat function whilst we perhaps pose some questions to Julie. I've had a good look, and in fact, I don't think I've ever chaired a webinar that's had such an active chat function ever. And we've been doing some very large webinars recently, so there's an amazing richness of content. So what stuck out for you, Julie, and in terms of the chats? Anything that you feel that you can respond to?
I think a couple of these are just sort of straightforward, pointers towards information. There was a lot of questions about where can someone get the details of their local childcare champion. So for that one, if you're internal DWP staff and you're not aware of who your champion is, then obviously come to me and I'll point you in the right direction. And I think, James, that we agreed that for external partners, they would contact you for the right childcare champion. Is that correct?
Sure, yeah. We're already rolling out the sharing of that to local authority early years and childcare teams.
And I do just have to give that health warning again, that these childcare champions, it's not their full-time role. So we've got to be careful about, what demands we're making. But but obviously have a chat and see what you can do together. So that was one. I mentioned the Childcare Ready to Choose booklet. It's actually on the Pacey website. It was something that, as I say, Pacey brought to our attention. It's also for internal DWP staff. It's on our Knowledge Hub. So we have our own internal Knowledge Hub. There is a specific section for early years and childcare. You will find information on the booklet and how to order the booklet if you want to on the Knowledge Hub. And again, for internal DWP staff, if you can't find that piece of information on the Knowledge Hub, obviously drop me a line and I'll send you the link. For external people, there is Pacey have actually developed a JCP specific page. So in terms of sort of supporting the work coaches with what they need. So if you go into the Pacey website, and there's actually, you can see that there is a specific tab for JCP Job Centre Plus. You'll find the booklet in there.
I noticed that Teresa Johnson from Pacey had put a link in on the chat earlier, but with the enormous amount of comments on chat, it might take people quite a long time to find that link. So I do have a slide coming up in a few moments that does include the Pacey link to some of those resources.
And I think the only other thing that I picked up, I mean, I did say earlier on that I'd apologise to my colleagues if I wasn't actually mentioning their specific good practice. And there is an awful lot of good practice, and at the moment some of that good practice is happening, as I say, by all sorts of virtual means. But the one thing that came up that I thought was worth mentioning is that another key member of staff within the DWP family is the Troubled Family Advisor. So that's a specific role, and their customers, they're a kind of a sort of work coach, but they're more equipped to deal with people that have a multitude of different barriers and challenges and are perhaps furthest from the labour market. And of course, at least part of that conversation is around childcare. So yeah, our Troubled Family Advisors are another key touch point for those childcare conversations. I think that was all I picked up, unless you saw anything, James, that I should have noticed and didn't.
I think there's probably one thing that needs reiterating, perhaps, because, and it was about managing those expectations, I think, because whenever you have a champion in an organisation, it's important to remind people, I think, that they are that, they provide a focus, and they are that's where the spotlight goes, but they're not asked to do everything when it comes to childcare. They are the conduit. So actually, a good champion will have an amazing impact on the whole workforce's understanding of childcare and their actions and support to it. I wouldn't want anybody to think that all of the childcare actions happen just by a childcare champion who has it as part of their job, and they might cover 3 local authority areas.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And I think that will put a couple of minds at rest when I look at some of the chats. So it's that sort of focus, but to share and distribute, I think is really. And
as I said, in my presentation, part of their role is to land resources with the work coaches, because it's actually the work coaches predominantly that are having these conversations. So it's about them being the sort of, signposting work coaches to the right resources and not having the conversations themselves. And also in terms of the external relationships, you might find that it is the childcare champion that's having those conversations with expert partners, but it may not be. But your childcare champion would be able to point you in the right direction.
And throughout the chat, like with health visiting, there's lots of examples of people saying this works really well. We've got a very good working relationship. They still remember you in Wiltshire. Alison, there's a comment there from Lucy in Wiltshire about your role then. I'll clarify and reiterate myself. The programme that we're doing in regional webinars at the moment for local authority early years and childcare teams, we're 3 in, and we've got 5 more to go, and we are connecting early years and childcare teams with Job Centre Plus champions. If you are from a local authority and you want to attend those regional webinars, your early years and childcare team should have the joining details for those webinars. They reconvene on the 23rd of February. If you find any difficulty finding how to book onto those sessions, do drop us an email and we will give you the booking details for those regional webinars. They're part of this same DFE project. And at those regional webinars, Pacey presents to all of those and talk about the Together for Twos programme, a great example of a programme that has been focusing on twos and with an emphasis on childminding as well. And it was that project that stimulated the creation of things like Childcare Champions and all of this good work. So it's fantastic to hear. And those examples will be shared at the regional webinars. And as I said, there's a Pacey link coming up. Did anything come up for you, Alison, by perusing very briefly all of those chat comments?
Yeah, thanks, James. I had a look through. Thank you for everybody putting your questions in. Something about the Healthy Child programme not just being delivered by health visitors, being delivered by family practitioners or nursery nurses. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. I don't want to get political. We have had quite a lot of cuts to the public health grant over the last 5 years, and areas are having to be pragmatic with their decision making. But health visitors should certainly be seeing all the vulnerable families, and then the nursery nurse can then flag those to the health if they identify children that would be eligible, both at the 9 to 12 month review or the 2-year review. We definitely still do home visits, absolutely, during COVID with the PPE, with their aprons on and the bags and the wind blowing in the rain. Health visitors are out there visiting families right now. Obviously, you know, doing social distancing, the way they're reaching families has changed. So some assessments are being done by video interaction, which is obviously not quite as good as face-to-face for spotting all vulnerabilities, but better than nothing. So definitely, if you are working with families that are struggling, I would say get them to contact their health visitor. Health visitors are out there and they're there to help families. The message is, you know, ask for help if you need it. The 2-year checks are mandated by the government, but obviously they are optional. Families don't have to have them. It's a service offer. But as a health visitor, I would be concerned if families didn't want to take up the offer. I'd be thinking, what is it about my service that makes it not attractive? Why do they not want it? So there's 2 ways of looking at that one. Well, let me just scrolling through. Were there any that jumped out at you, James?
There were. I was particularly struck by the slide that finished with ambitions to do more with data and data sharing and analytics to flag children earlier. I think a thing that I hear commonly in the early years and childcare world is a desire to do more information and data sharing with health visitors, health in general. What would be your top tips for achieving local data sharing for this purpose?
So I know that some areas have got good practice, and it's about data sharing agreements, obviously following GDPR. We're actually doing a project at the moment with the Health Foundation at the Institute of Health Visiting, looking at analytical capability in health visiting, and they've reported the preliminary findings to Andrea Ledson's review in the early years, because I know she's looking at this. From the eyes of the parent, many of them think we are one NHS and one healthcare system, but over the years it's become so fragmented that it doesn't feel like that sometimes. But definitely that is the ambition of the government, to move in that direction, to have better data sharing, because often it's the little pieces of the jigsaw that fit together. And as you start to look at the whole picture, you start to see. So I know my last trust that I worked in was in Hampshire, and they would get data feeds from accident and emergency, from children's social care, from adult mental health already. So they've got those arrangements in place. So it is possible if you've got good interoperability. I think the ambition to have a single healthcare record is probably far away into the future, but that doesn't mean we can't do something now to improve things.
Okay, and like Job Centre Plus, lots of stuff in the chat around the positive connections that local areas have got with their health visitors, and the integration with checks and the role, all the things that we would expect to happen. But what would you say to an area or a service who would like to do more and foster a stronger relationship with their health visiting colleagues? What advice would you give them in terms of how they could approach that?
I mean, I think it's starting already. So certainly the work that's been done on early language, I think that set a huge precedent about how integrated working works really well. So there's lots to learn from the Public Health England published the integrated pathway not that long ago, which got some really practical implementation science driven simple ways. I mean, the punchline is get to know each other. It's all about relationships, isn't it? It's about brokering relationships with parents. And that could be a whole multitude of professionals that do that get alongside parents. But health visitors have that unique role, seeing all families. but also brokering relationships amongst sectors, so between education and health and children's services, to have better partnership working. I think COVID has been fabulous, because what it's shown us is that actually we can do it. So the areas that have done really well, you know, the years and years of bureaucracy that have stood in the way, people actually stopped and thought, okay, we need to do something to support our vulnerable families now. We knew that families being shut down and locked indoors, you know, the outcomes were going to be bad for some of those families if we didn't work together. And, you know, they've broken down those barriers and really developed great partnership working. So I say build on your COVID workarounds. I just did want to pick up one point, which is about the variation, because we're very aware that there are 149 local authorities reporting data to Public Health England, and probably 149 ways of doing health visiting now, because of just the way the service is governed. And so we're calling on the government to have a greater level of consistency for health visitors, because it should be the same for families, whether you live in Stockport or Southampton. You know, broadly speaking, you should have the same offer, which should be based on your level of need, not where you live. So there is that postcode lottery that's going on that I know people are keen to redress. A lot of it comes down to funding. I know when I worked in Hampshire, it didn't matter how we did the maths. You know, there wasn't enough money or enough staff in place to deliver the Healthy Child programme the way it was intended. So the elephant in the room needs to be seen. And so a lot of the work that we are doing in the IHV is about speaking out about government policy and how important it is. You know, the slide that I showed earlier about the cost savings of early intervention, you know, £23 billion we're wasting a year getting it wrong. Well, not wasting, but spending, getting it wrong. You know, it's important for those families that need it, but far better to go upstream. In health visiting, we have the analogy of, you know, do you build fences at the top of the river or have ambulances at the bottom to fish people out? You know, it's far cheaper to support early. And the 2-year offer is an intervention. I think, you know, if we see it as an intervention, you know, to support families, then that's helpful too.
Well, and your chevrons on the other slide were I think, an exact match about what we're all trying to achieve in early years and childcare. So we are speaking a common language. It reminded me of Lord Laming's report, you know, which asked us to all play our part in supporting children, regardless of those artificial professional boundaries. So thank you very much for that. I heard the quote about health visiting is a bit like glue that brings things together. The disadvantage with glue, of course, is that everything sticks and everybody tries to stick things on you. And I'm very aware that health visitors are often asked to do lots of things added on to their role. They have an important core role. And today we're about saying to health visitors, you could do this, could you do this as part of your role and integrate it so it doesn't feel like something that's overburdensome.
I think that's a really good point. You know, health visitors are visiting these families anyway. So it's just about being smarter when you see them. Just remember to ask them about it and to signpost. Majority of families, you know, being poor doesn't mean you're vulnerable. So it's signposting them to what they're entitled to in terms of their income. But also spotting the families who maybe, you know, won't take up the offer for all sorts of factors and getting alongside them and supporting them. And it might not be the health visitor who's best placed to do that, but can certainly signpost to people who can, like the parent champions that we've heard about already today.
Okay, thank you, Alison. You were another early phone call when we started this short project, and it's been fantastic working with you. And I really appreciate that presentation and the work that you've done to promote today's event to health visitors and colleagues to support them to attend today. So thank you very much for that. If I could just have the next slide. There's a brief task here. Given this group is incredibly good at the chat function, I think we should use it to our advantage. And I'm going to ask you a question and ask you to put your answers into the chat function. Having been on this webinar for almost 3 hours, we're just in the last few 10 or 15 minutes of today's session. What does it occur to you that you could do as part of your role, whether you're a children's centre outreach, a social worker, a health visitor, a Job Centre Plus person? What has today's webinar supported you to think that you could do as a result of today. So we'll pause for 2 or 3 minutes for you to put your answers to that question in the chat. Well, that's an incredibly powerful log of hundreds of commitments to take action, to perhaps choose new language choices, to make phone calls, to connect with different roles, to foster partnership working between agencies, to share information, to hold information, to seek out new information, or even develop information as well. And a tremendously powerful list. I'm blown away by it. It's looking like eBay on here, the amount of things that are coming up very, very quickly. And that's simply what our mission was today, was to ask you to do what you can to support children and families to access the entitlement, to support you in your role. My colleagues are going to be putting the evaluation link up for you in a few moments, which will be there and probably will quickly disappear in the frenzy of chat comments. So I'll ask him to put it on 2 or 3 times over the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, because it's the evaluation link that we want you to click, and we'll put it on right at the end as well, to answer those 2 or 3 questions and then access the resources. But if we think about what could we do, if we could just have a look at the next slide, how would we summarize some of those things that we're asking you to do, or indeed you are volunteering to do on that huge list here of commitments? Well, we are asking you to be positive and excited about the entitlements. Can be very easy to get bogged down and confused by the complexity and the detail and the complicatedness of it, but at its essence, these are amazing opportunities for children and families that we really don't want them to miss out on. It's an exciting offer. It changes children's lives. That's exactly why this session is called Childcare Changes Lives. Motivate people to find out more and engage, and that might be to motivate you or the families that you're working with, or indeed colleagues. And I'm sure there's going to be a tremendous amount of communication, verbal and emails and all sorts of things, given these commitments of these actions that you've shared just now. Be in touch with Job Centre Plus childcare champions, with early years and childcare teams in local authorities, with providers of childcare and early education. The list is endless. Keep up to date with what local provision is out there and how it's changing and what it's offering. Be in touch with the local authority early years team and their information service, which may still be called the Families Information Service. Value all types of childcare provider, including childminding, home-based, small group, large group, private day nursery, in schools. They all deliver very similar services to the same standards, and consider how they match up to the different needs of families. One size doesn't fit all, to borrow a phrase from earlier, so it's important that we match provision to the needs of families. Use those different messages for different families. What do families need and want to hear? What messages will make the difference and turn a barrier into an open door and actual take-up of childcare? Local processes do vary, as Alison was saying, in terms of health visiting. So know the local processes, connect with early years and childcare teams, and they will be more than happy to help. In the old days, we used to talk about carrying and giving away information. There's still a role for us to do that, but then how in a digital world can we carry and give away information? What can we share and how? And make sure that we have those key pieces of information. There's plenty of links in today's slides around how you can access that online, and your local teams will again provide much more information for you. Next slide. You could help parents get online. and find out more. Childcare Choices has a parents area and a professionals area, so there's benefits to all of us for accessing that central national resource. And we've already promoted the use of the childcare calculator. That really does provide a search engine through the complexity of this offer as to what would be the best match for the families. Help them to apply. There are IT barriers, there are confidence, literacy and language barriers. So help parents to apply and remind them to reconfirm if they are accessing a provision that they need to reconfirm. And promote other sources of support as well, tax-free childcare and that vital support that's extra for children with SEND, special educational needs and disabilities. And help do whatever we can to connect parents to childcare providers. I've worked with a lot of people who have taken a family to see a childcare provider for the first time, because crossing that threshold, that doorstep, can be the final barrier that does need that additional help. Next slide, and I think probably almost my final slide for today. Put the information that you collect and links in your literature and your newsletters or on your websites. And there's the link to some of the resources that Pacey have delivered for you to have a look at too. Discuss today in team meetings. Share the recording of today's event. We'll be letting you know when that's available and how to access it. Share the slides. You will get access to those once you complete the evaluation. You might want to hold a training session or indeed invite a speaker such as the local authority early years team or a local childcare provider or somebody who fully understands the complexity of the process and will be able to answer your detailed questions. Refer parents to children's centres or similar services where they exist. Help is out there. And include the entitlements and family plans. They should be part of how we support families to make sense of their family life and in their journeys through to reach their ambitions and goals. Next slide. Because we all have a role to play in childcare, and this is what I said right at the beginning of today's webinar, almost 3 hours ago. Childcare and early learning and early years education, however you want to describe it, does support children to grow, develop and learn whilst preparing for school. It helps us reach children earlier and identify if they have any unmet needs, whether that be learning, social or health. And it enables parents to make choices in economic, employment and training directions. So final slide. Thank you to everybody who's contributed today and for your amazing input on today's chat. It's wonderful to see so many commitments and actions. The final ask is that you do click onto that evaluation link, which has been posted by Hempsall Consultancies on the chat. The resources in terms of the slides are available for you at the end of that. We will send you an email in the next few days to tell you when the recording's ready and a reminder as to where those slides are. And we will have a look at the chat and some of those frequently asked questions as well. But thank you for taking the time today to join us on the Changing Lives Through Childcare national webinar. It's been amazing to see over 800 people attend this morning. So please go out there and do whatever you can to support least advantaged children, particularly 2-year-olds, with their preschool learning and childcare for them and their families, and to support all of us in our professional roles to help children and families. Thank you very much and have a brilliant rest of the day.